Hey, what's up, y'all? We are back again. It's the HPR Chronicles with Shakur and Smith. It's a podcast about politics, history, politics, and race from a pop culture's perspective. We're going to try to break it down simple and plain so you guys can understand, like we say every week. I'm a filmmaker from Trinidad. I've traveled a lot. I love history. Chris is a veteran of the Army Reserve that works for the VA. He has a passion for history. It's about truth. It's not pro any race, just pro truth. If the truth offends you, we're sorry, not sorry. And Crispy usually says it with me.
Oh,
we're sorry, not sorry. That's what we usually say. That's a normal spiel. Last week, we talked about apartheid in South Africa.
Yeah.
And hopefully you guys had a chance to look that stuff up. Don't forget to follow us on social media. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube and all the other platforms.
Yeah.
And thank you, everybody, for listening on Google Play Music, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Buzzsprout, all the cell phone apps. Just like to always say thank you. We appreciate you guys checking in and listening to what we have to say about politics, history, and race. It was Juneteenth last week as well. Hopefully you guys had a chance to check in and see what that's about. And maybe we can get some Juneteenth celebrations going in the future. That was last week. Yeah. So this week I'm going to take my notes like I normally do in case I have a question. And Crispy is going to jump it off about the myths of slavery. So I'm going to let him take it away.
So some time ago we were, this is how I wanted to start my thing is my passion is not just, from... It's deeper. Like my family came to visit, my mother, my aunt, my cousin, and we were watching some of the podcasts and everything as a family.
You didn't tell me that. You guys were checking in on the podcast and stuff.
I don't have to tell you everything.
I think you guys mentioned it when we were at the
Actually,
wine.
we did, yeah.
But I brought it you guys up. It really.
So we were watching, and my mother, actually all three of them was like, "Oh, we have a topic for you to discuss." And I was like, "Oh, sure. What is it?" And they're talking about Willie Lynch, and I'm like, William Lynch, okay, I'll do. And my cousin sent me, or my aunt sent me a link. And I'm looking, and I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, this is a great topic. So, because if you're not familiar, William Lynch, there's this letter where he supposedly delivers it to in West Indies to a bunch of slave owners, and it's basically how to break down and control,
make a slave, break a slave,
make another slave. Is another thing
stuff
about it. So, as what will you do? We always research our information and look it up, and we start looking up, and I couldn't find anything factual. Everything was coming back like this is false, and and in certain sites. And I'm not to sound too wrong, but when you got a white person who's telling you something's not right, you always kind of got a question, just because things are not always portrayed correctly. So I continued doing as much, digging, and then I really read the letter, and it just seems pretty inconsistent for the time period it would have come out. So my point in saying all that is, I decided to instead talk about myths with slavery in particular.
Right. So before you go, though, what I want to say, last week when I was talking about we had some inconsistencies in the topic, that's the topic that I was referring to. I just wanted to say, because even when, what's funny, guys, is Crispy came over, and I didn't even know he was going to do the Willie Lynch or wanted to talk about it. I had decided to do it as well, because I was killing on time. And I printed the whole letter up. And Chris was like, man, there's some inconsistencies. I'm not sure. And then sure enough, I started digging a little deeper, and I saw some of the same things. So like I said last week, we don't like to touch things that unless they're factual.
Yeah. If we can't,
know what I mean? So anyway.
If we can't find some proof, if it could still be controversial. There could be still some subjects that there'll be different views of it. But there still has to be like a real person, So
So anyway, so I just want to say that's what I was referring to last week when I said there was a topic. That was the topic.
Yeah. So that made me just think about myths. Like when I'm talking to someone and a friend tells me, and we're talking about slavery, and they're like, "Well, there's been a lot of people enslaved." You're like, "Huh? What? Why?" And
they always
go,
say that too.
Yeah, the Irish, and I was like, "Huh?" Again, I haven't done the history of it, so
Yeah.
I lay off. You just kind of. But at the same time, it's kind of upsetting because it's like, that's not what I was really trying to talk about at the times. I'm dealing with a different slavery. So anyway, my thing of finding is there are some very common myths that are out there about slavery. And the myth number one is there were Irish slaves in the American colonies. So as historian and, it's been written, a historian and public librarian Liam Hogan has written, there is unanimous agreement based on overwhelming evidence that the Irish were never subjected to perpetual hereditary slavery in the colonies based on notions of race. So the point in that statement is there were people brought over from Ireland who were indentured servants, not slaves, but servants. And slaves it was perpetual, hereditary. So if you were born of a slave, you were born into slavery. Oh, okay. It wasn't like you could be born and just be out of it. And it just continued on perpetually. So the enduring myth of Irish slavery, which most often surfaces today on several of Irish nationalist and white supremacist causes, has roots in the 17th and 18th century when Irish laborers were derogatory, I can't speak, were called white slaves. The phrase would later be employed as propaganda by the slave-owning South about the industrial North, along with false claims that life was far harder for immigrant factory workers than for slaves. So again, it's always comparing, black slaves to other races and how they're the same when in no way, shape, or form were they.
It wasn't the same, right?
So what's the truth of it? There were a large number of indentured servants that did indeed immigrate from Ireland to the British colonies of North America, where they provided a cheap labor force for planters and merchants eager to exploit it. Though most crossed the Atlantic willingly. Some Irish men and women, including criminals as well as simply the poor and vulnerable, were sentenced to indentured servitude in Ireland and forcibly shipped to the colonies to carry out their sentences. So there were some, but they were poor, criminals, and then just some who couldn't probably afford the way of life and let themselves get sold into service for someone. But indentured,
so they did have some, but it was just a few.
Yes, correct. Okay. But indentured servitude.
Oh, okay. They weren't slaves.
They weren't slaves. None of this is slavery. Okay. This is still indentured servitude. I mean, they were sold, but that's because they probably were sold. Okay, so here it is. Indentured servitude, by definition, came nowhere close to chattel slavery. For one thing, it was temporary. All but the most serious felons were freed at the end of their contracts. Oh, so they kind of got into an agreement of and how long that would be. The colonial system also offered more lenient punishment for disobedient servants than slaves, and also servants for petition for and allowed servants to petition for early release if their masters mistreated them. You know what I mean? So if you were treated wrongly and you could ask to be, this is so wrong, I should be able to get out of this servitude.
Right.
Slavery was not like that. You could not complain.
And apartheid wasn't either.
Yeah.
We learned last week.
So most importantly, servitude wasn't hereditary. Children of indentured servants were born free. Slaves' children were property of their owners. So myth number one, even though Irish were here and they were servants, they were not slaves. They were not captured in the millions and killed as Africans were. At the one point, I think it said there was 40,000 people who came over. Again, that number is nowhere near to the millions. So myth number two about slavery: the South seceded from the Union over the issue of state rights, not slavery. So I've again been talking to someone, and you hear about, why remove the Confederate flag and all this other stuff. It's about our history. The Union Confederates, they really weren't about slavery.
Yeah.
They just wanted to be able to have their own the rights of their states. No. So this myth that the Civil War was fundamentally a conflict over slavery would have been a surprise to the original founders of the Confederacy. In the official declaration of the causes of their succession in December 1860, South Carolina delegates cited an increasing hostility on the part of their non-slave holding states to the institution of slavery. So according to them, the Northern interference with the return of fugitive slaves was violating their constitutional obligations. They also complained that some states in New England tolerated abolitionists. And if you don't remember, abolitionists was people who were trying to end slavery and allow they allowed tolerate abolitionist societies. So where people felt everyone should be free and allow black men to vote. So those issues they didn't like, and they didn't want that to come into their land.
Right.
And
so
if you want to say
it was about slavery.
It was about slavery,
and not the state,
and not the state. No, right. So and more to it. The Confederates opposed state rights. The right of the North states not to support slavery. The idea that the war was somehow not about slavery, but about the issue of state rights was perpetrated by later generations anxious to redefine their ancestors' sacrifice as a noble protection of the Southern way of life. Right. So I may have fumbled that up, but the point of that statement is nowadays you hear people talk about state rights simply so that they can rewrite the fact that their parents really just wanted to keep slaves. Right.
Right. I'm following you. That's funny.
So at the time, however, Southerners had no problem claiming the protection of slavery as the cause of their break with the Union, and the Civil War followed.
Right.
Okay? So another myth: only a small percentage of Southerners own slaves. You always hear that some argument. Yeah. My family, we didn't have. Okay. Right. Closely related to the previous myth, the idea that the vast majority of Confederate soldiers were men of modest means rather than large plantation owners is usually used to reinforce the contention that the South wouldn't have gone to war to protect slavery. So basically, this is kind of a way to say, well, they really, not a lot of people had slaves, so their fight wasn't for slavery because not everybody owned slaves.
Right.
Well, the 1860 census showed that in the states that would soon secede from the Union, an average of more than 32% of white families owned slaves.
Right.
Some states had far more slave owners. So like in South Carolina, like you just said, there was 46% of whites owned slaves.
Wow.
49%.
Almost half the population, half the whites. Yeah.
49% in Mississippi. And while there were some with less, like 20% in Arkansas. Good job, Arkansas. Yeah. But the percentage doesn't fully express the extent to which the South was a slave society built on a foundation of slavery. Many of those white families who couldn't afford slaves aspired to, because it was a symbol in wealth and prosperity, to have slaves. Basically, the ideology of white supremacy that served as a rationale for slavery made it extremely difficult and terrifying for white Southerners to imagine life alongside a black majority population that was not in bondage. So in this way, many non-slaving Confederates went to war to protect not only slavery, but to preserve the foundation of the only way of life they knew. So they couldn't fathom just being blacks just walking around freely. That idea and that concept to them was terrifying. Yeah. So they were like, nah.
And
let's go to war. We want to keep these people.
Yeah, you want to know what's funny? If I can interject real quick, to me, it seems like it's almost like a case of, we know what we've done to this group of people, and now that they're free, what if they want to retaliate and get revenge. You know what I'm saying? It's almost like if you wrongly treat a neighbor bad, let's just say, and then set that neighbor free, you're gonna be worried about that neighbor coming after.
Back. Yeah. You know what I agree. I do think there's a lot. Which if we want to talk about future, I want to look into the term and the ideas behind white supremacy.
Yeah.
Just really all of a sudden after the apartheid comments and some of the other stuff, it's just interesting to hear and how the Europeans colonized so many other ethnicities, like just everywhere, and just treated everyone that they came across pretty much like they were shit. And they were the So anyway, where did I finish? So
that was myth number 3.
Yeah. So the next myth is number 4. The Union went to war to end slavery.
Right. I even thought that, but
I even thought that too. You always want to give it. So on the northern side, the rose-colored myth of the Civil War is that the blue-clad Union soldiers and their brave, doomed leader, Abraham Lincoln, were fighting to free the slaves. They weren't. Okay, so not initially, they weren't. But they were fighting to hold the nation together. Okay. So you could, so it
wasn't about the slaves. It wasn't. They just wanted to make sure the nation
stayed together as one. Because, like they said, they didn't want to separate. The South, they did pull away. Yeah. They created their own capital. Well, we'll talk about that more. Yeah. So Lincoln was known to personally oppose slavery, which is why the South succeeded after his election in 1860. But his chief goal was preserving the Union. In August 1862, he famously wrote to the New York Tribune, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it."
Right, I heard about that.
And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. Right. So he was willing to just do anything, but it was only to keep the nation
to preserve the Union. Yeah.
And in the end,
wow, that's interesting.
So the slaves themselves helped make the case for emancipation as a military aim, fleeing in droves behind the lines of approaching Union armies. Early in the conflict, some of Lincoln's generals helped the president understand that sending these men and women back to bondage could only help the Confederate cause. Mm-hmm. So the front, their line is coming. Slaves were just running, and they would get on the other side, where, of course, they're more free than they are. Right. And because it was other people's property and all the other laws that they had, technically they should have, I guess, been returning them. But then it was like, if you return them, you're not hurting them. Right. Which again, So then by the fall of 1862, Lincoln had become concerned that acting to end slavery was a necessary step. A month after his letter to Greeley, Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation, which would take effect in January 1863. So, what does it say? It proclaimed free all slaves. So he did proclaim that all slaves would be free, but anyone who was still in the South, it's not like they forcibly removed them until later, until after.
Right. So in other words, they didn't, even though that was what was said,
it's not really
that was law. They didn't really enforce it.
Exactly.
Right. They didn't go in and enforce it. Like, hey, let's do a sweeping, enforcement checks and balances down the South to make sure no one's holding any slaves. And even though they had changed the law.
Yeah. And we definitely have examples, or I think mentioned stuff where once they left, stuff went kind of
it went south
again. It's like
again.
So.
And I wanted to say before you go to myth number 5. I want to say, for all you kids listening and also at school where they try to tell you that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, do not believe that, because I'd also heard that wasn't his initial, real and initial intent.
And I think I even
it
talked
was about the Union. Yeah, I think you mentioned it before too. Yeah,
he would have. He was looking into a way to send slaves back. or if they weren't slaves, just the free ones, back to Africa.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't care either way.
Yeah.
His aim was let's get the United States united together.
Which I give him. I mean, that's a credit point, but the fact that it wasn't to help a group of large majority of
that's not what it was
human
about.
beings. That's upsetting. Yeah. So myth number 5: Black soldiers, slave and free, fought for the Confederacy.
Yeah.
So this argument, a staple among those seeking to redefine the conflict as an abstract battle over state rights. Again, this is more about state rights rather than the fight to preserve slavery. Doesn't really hold up because white officers in the Confederacy they would bring slaves with them, and they were brought to the front during the Civil War. But they were only there to cook, clean, and perform other labors for the officers and their regiments. There's no evidence at all to suggest that significant numbers of black soldiers fought for the Confederate banner against Union soldiers. In fact, until March 1865, Confederate Army policy specifically prohibited blacks from serving as soldiers. So the policy was that it could never happen. So anyone who's trying to tell you this stuff is just, spurting lies and mistruths to make themselves not. I know what I wanted to look up. So some Confederate officers wanted to. There were some who wanted to enlist slaves earlier, like General Patrick Cleburne proposed enlisting African American soldiers as early as 1864, but Jefferson Davis rejected the suggestion and ordered it never to be discussed again. So. Again, it wasn't happening. It never did happen. Finally, in the last weeks of the conflict or the war, the Confederate government gave in to General Robert Lee's desperate plea for more men, allowing slaves to enlist in exchange for some kind of post-war freedom. So in 1964, they actually was like, okay, maybe we'll do something. But it's still not like a bunch of, so a small number signed up for training, but there's no evidence at all that they saw any action so that they actually did really fight someone,
Right.
So that's the thing I was wanting to cover was the myths that, you're talking to a friend about something important and then they, go, it's okay. Because there were other people who were slaves. Like
I hate that argument. I always say,
why be mad at me? I didn't own slaves. No one, only so many people own slaves.
Right.
No. Right. It was if you're in the South and if you have roots that you can ancestries that you can really point to the South, there's a good chance they possibly own some slaves.
And another thing too, when we're talking about this subject,
one last thing. If they didn't own, they wanted to own.
Right.
That's all.
Right. And it's funny when we talk about these subjects, people always make it seem as if we're upset at that person we're talking to. No one's implying that we're upset at the person we're talking to.
Yeah.
What does upset us is when people try to deny what really happened and try and disconnect their ancestors from what really happened.
Deny or belittle it or make it seem like it's not as bad as,
Oh, the so-and-so were enslaved too. And so many people of them got, we're not talking about them. I'm talking about these group of people. That's what I'm talking about. And one of the shows I want to cover Brazil so bad, man, because so many more slaves went to South America than the Americas. A lot of people may not know that. So I definitely want to cover the history of Brazil, and maybe I'll try to do it next episode, man. I just got to find the time to get some study in, but I definitely want to do that because I think it was like 8 to 10 million slaves went to South America, Brazil. And here it was only, I forget how many, the numbers, but it wasn't near as much. I think it was less than half came to the Americas.
I almost want to say like 4 and
something
then they
like
had
that.
10.
Yeah, and they had like 8 or 10, and it's crazy. And those people are still living in the favelas and stuff to this day. You know what I mean? So I'd love to cover the history of Brazil and South America and stuff. But
it sort of seems like
what happened.
Were able to embrace it, and the color is not that. I mean, it may all depend on where you're at, but just a little of interaction. I talked to someone
Yeah, it's bad in Brazil though. I mean, they don't. Yeah, I mean, it's almost like the apartheid thing. They don't allow blacks to do anything in Brazil.
Huh.
No, yeah, they have them in the favelas, living in slums.
Oh, okay.
Those are all the descendants of those slaves. I mean, they've just after they built it up and did everything, they just threw them up in the hills.
So these are just truly African slaves, or are they like mixed with the?
Well, of course, some people mix just like
Okay.
they did here, but most of them are blacks up there.
Got it.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Most of them are blacks. If you go to those favelas, most of them are blacks.
Okay.
And just like in all the other societies, there is colorism based on class and stuff. Like the lighter Brazilians that are more European, you know, they get treated a certain way, and the people that were mostly blacks or mixed with blacks, they're shunned and in the poor parts, and it's the exact nothing's changed. But in Brazil, it's really, really bad. You know what I mean? I know this is off topic, but it just makes me think about all that stuff as you talked about all those myths and stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, I definitely wanna cover Brazil and what happened with slavery. And it's funny, I don't even know if my daughter knows it, because my daughter is 25% Irish.
Yeah.
Her mom is half Irish and half Korean, because her dad was 100% Irish.
Okay.
And I wonder if Mark, if his family were descendants of they came and migrated. And
That's
you know what I mean?
Yeah,
So yeah, but I definitely want to say, definitely learn those myths, especially the kids in school where they teach this this propaganda, this history that's not really reality, and make you think certain historical figures have done significant things to change the way society went, history went. And it's just not true. And Abraham Lincoln is a prime example of it.
And another point in doing this specific podcast and just about the whole myth thing is the spread of misinformation. So I kind of wanted to say, there are times you're going through Facebook or something and you come across an article and it feels, and as you're reading it, it may be captivating enough emotionally that you just get into it and you're like, oh my God, I hate this, and you want to share it. Before sharing, double check your information.
Absolutely.
That's what I really want people to know is something can be, you can read something and it just sounds great, or it fits how you're feeling that day, or things you've heard. And I'm not saying it's not, but at least double check it before you spread it on to someone else. So. Right.
That's cool. Is that it?
That is it.
Yeah, that was good stuff, guys. And like he said, recheck and check, and don't believe the hype. Don't, especially in schools. Don't believe those stories that they tell you guys. Don't forget to follow us on social media. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section below. Thank those on YouTube and all the platforms, like I always say. You can email us at rptalktruth@gmail.com, and we will bring you 2 good topics the next couple of weeks coming up. Probably, like I said, I'm probably going to do Brazil, and I want to do the name too, the name identity, and how we were stripped of our original names and why, and the effect that has on us today as a people.
Okay.
I want to do that as well. Brazil, and there was another one that I wanted to do. But anyway, yeah, I'm just thinking out loud while we're ending the podcast, guys. But anyway, thanks again for checking in.
And those aren't exclusively your.
No,
because I was thinking about the Brazil too.
Yeah, you can do that if you want. I don't mind, as long as we cover it and give the people the correct information.
And I really did consider it for a second for this one, but then, like I said, after just knowing how information just travels, and no one ever, and again, I do remember reading, and going back to the Willie Lynch thing is, because people said that's how lynching the word came from, and everything like that. Again, I just wanted to make sure it was facts, and I couldn't find anything. So, again, my point is, when you're reading something, just double check. Just do another couple searches. Don't just take because the second person could be referencing each other. They could be, you know what I mean? So be careful, look for History Channel You know, there's definitely spots.
Cross-reference. Yeah, that's what he's trying to say.
Thank
Make
you.
sure you cross-reference.
Right.
And don't forget to subscribe, guys. Subscribe on all of the platforms. I think you can. Yeah, you can subscribe on Spotify and Google Play Music and iTunes. And on your podcast apps, and of course on YouTube. Make sure you guys subscribe so you can keep getting all the information, and make sure you hit the notification button where it automatically downloads and all that good stuff. Thanks again for checking in. It's the HPR Chronicles with Shakur and Smith, and we're out until next time. Peace out.